There's the pass to Leitner. Puts it up. Yes!
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Cameron Chronicles. Max here. We have a great episode with Chris Spatola of ESPN for you today. Really appreciate Chris for coming on the pod and giving his insights on a variety of topics. We talked Chris's time as Director of Basketball Ops here at Duke from 2008 to 2012, his relationship with Coach K, as well as this year's team, among other topics. Before we get started, though, just wanted to give an update on what we've got going on content-wise, with the season now just 3 weeks away. Crazy to say that. Check out DukeChronicle.com for our coverage from last week's ACC Media Days and Friday's Countdown to Craziness, and stay tuned for more preseason preview content over the next couple of weeks. So without further ado, here's our chat with Chris. All right, so Chris, thanks for joining us. You obviously have a relationship with Coach K. You were on the Duke men's basketball coaching staff from 2007 to 2012, I believe. You were Director of Basketball Operations for 4 years there as well. So can you just talk a little bit about how your relationship with Coach K started?
Yeah, I've known Coach K a long time. I actually, I'm married to his youngest daughter. I've known him longer than I've known her. And I met both of them at his basketball camp. My dad used to drive us down. My dad was my high school coach, and he would drive us down from the Northeast to go to Duke's basketball camp. My dad was a big Coach K fan, and as a lot of coaches at that time were. This was, mid 90s. And so he would drive us down to camp, and I was one of the better players at the camp. So I got to know Coach through that, being there. I met his daughter. His daughter was working the concession stand, which showed you how focused I was on becoming a better basketball player. I was picking up Coach K's youngest daughter at the concession stand. But that's kind of how I met him, and he helped me. He was very instrumental in helping me get to Army during that recruiting process while they were recruiting me. So that's kind of how I met him, and I've known him ever since.
Did your relationship with him change at all after you went to Army? I know obviously he speaks a lot about what he learned there at West Point, obviously in a different era, but what was the relationship like after you finish your basketball career at Army, but then also finish your time in service?
Yeah, it's a great question, because it did. Like unless you've been through West Point, it's very hard to explain it and to talk about it with other people, and so to speak the same language of cadetisms, it took our relationship to another level. It's funny, Max. Coach K and I have had several different iterations of our relationship. When we first met, when I got to West Point, when I got engaged to his daughter, and had to ask him for if that was okay with him, if I asked his daughter to marry me. When we eventually got married, when I was in the Army, the active Army, and when I deployed, he was very, very encouraging and so sensitive and helpful and just so kind while I was deployed. And then when my time in the military was winding down, you have to do 5 years of active duty service when you go to West Point. So when my 5 years was winding down, I thought maybe coaching was going to be something that I wanted to do. He had a spot on his staff, and he offered it to me, a graduate assistant spot. So now I'm his employee, which took the relationship to another level. And then obviously I ended up leaving his staff to join the media, but now we have grandkids, and that's taken the relationship to another. So Coach and I over the decades we've gone through several different iterations of our relationship.
Right. And then, what kind of convinced you to specifically join the staff? You said you had an interest in going into coaching, but that's obviously, a lot of people have an interest in coaching. It just sometimes it never really comes to fruition. So what really led you to take that job and to, take on that role?
It was, obviously if coaching is something that you think you want to get into, obviously there's no better place to learn. So that was even more than anything else, to be able to learn under a guy who was he wasn't at the time, but was eventually going to be the all-time wins leader and everything we know about Coach. that was a no-brainer. The fact that he had just started doing USA basketball, and I thought I might be able to get involved with that to the level that it was going to be, was a huge bonus. Bringing my wife back here, her entire family, as I think live in this area. So we had been in Oklahoma for 5 years, and I don't think she or I ever imagined we'd live in Oklahoma for 5 years. So the opportunity to come back and bring her back home was a part of that calculation, was a part of that decision. And the thing is too, Max, like, I've been very lucky. Like, I've been a part of, and I'm a big believer that success in life is a byproduct of who you surround yourself with. So, I was with West Point and the United States military. Then I was at Duke. Now I'm with ESPN and SiriusXM. Like, I've always been around groups and people who have made me better and have lifted my water level. So that was the other thing. Again, to be a part of Duke University and a part of Duke basketball was a no-brainer, regardless of my relationship to Coach.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I saw a quote from you about talking about how the military and specifically the Army and being at West Point, that's the best team in the world. You consider that to be. I know there's obviously zero comparison between being part of the military and being part of a sports team. But, it's been talked so much about how Coach K uses a lot of what he learned in the military to apply and applies it to the way he runs his program. What did you see in terms of that, and what are those similarities? Because that's always been something that he's talked about so much.
Yeah. It's there's a lot there. The biggest thing, and it's interesting, the recent passing of Colin Powell, God rest his soul. I heard him give a talk one time, and he was talking about his definition of leadership, and leadership being, leadership is essentially taking an organization beyond what the science of management would normally expect of an organization. So there are a lot of folks who teach leadership, and there's a lot of incubators that study leadership. But the fundamental element to all of that is the ability to trust. And the reason that the military is what it is the stakes are so high. So it forces everybody who's a part of that organization to raise their level to the stakes, obviously life, death, fighting wars on foreign soil, et cetera. So there's this level of trust that you're able to develop within an organization that, the person to your left, the person to your right believes in a lot of the same things, understands the consequences, and has a standard that they hold themselves to that is a standard of excellence. That's how Coach K runs his basketball program. He's not a micromanager. He was a terrific boss. He lets you do your job. That's one of the reasons I went and worked for him. Like, obviously my relationship to him put me on his radar. It certainly helped my cause, but Coach K's no dummy. He's not hiring me unless I can come in and do a good job and do it under his management style, which was to allow us to do our thing. There was a high level of trust within that organization, within his team that I identified with. There's a standard of excellence. I mean, you've been around it, Max. There's a standard of excellence in Duke basketball that, I get to see a lot of programs now. There are a good number that share that sort of DNA of having a standard. And if you don't meet it, you're not going to be a part of it. But there are a lot who don't. They just don't have that sort of expectation. And I identified with that. So there are a lot of parallels. There's a lot of ways where, people always ask me, how has Coach K changed over the years he's been doing this? His tone has changed. He talks to his teams now differently than he talked to his teams that had, for example, Jay Billis on him. But Max, his values have not changed. What he believed to be right back when he came to Duke in the early 80s to what he believes now, it's the same value system. There's just a different way of expressing it. And those values are ones that he learned at Army, that he learned from his parents, and they're values that I identify with. And again, it made it a no-brainer to join his organization.
That's the thing that really stands out to me is the value system. I think, well, like I said, you can never compare being in the military to being on a sports team, but there are obviously some traits that you have to be successful in any profession. So that makes a lot of sense. I wanted to shift gears a little bit, if that's fine with you, kind of to this year's team. You obviously were at media days last week over in Charlotte. Just with the preseason poll coming out actually this morning, we're recording here Tuesday afternoon. So what are your thoughts on this year's Duke team, and what are some of the strengths and maybe some of the weaknesses that you see from this team?
Well, I think the fact that I asked Coach K during media day, how would you compare the experience level of this team versus teams you've had over the last few years? And he said he thinks it's his most experienced team. The ability to bring back a Wendell Moore, the ability to get a Mark Williams to come back for a sophomore year. It sounds crazy, but that's the world we live in now, where, a guy like Williams has the finish to the season he had last year. He's 7 feet tall. A lot of those guys are bolting now. All right, I'm out of here. I've done my job. The ability to get a Jeremy Roach back is huge, and then you supplement that with, at least a couple guys in the immediate, from what I've observed and seen, Max, a couple guys who are physically ready to compete. I mean, Paolo Banchero is ready to go now. He's 6'9". They list him at 6'10". He's just physically, he's different. That's not how they used to make freshmen. Well, they're making them like that now. Trevor Keels, I think, gives them a defensive dimension that they haven't had. That physical, gritty, player at the point of attack who can guard the ball, who can guard the other team's best perimeter player, I think is big. And then to supplement that with a Theo John, who I think up front, Max, I think this is going to be a real strength for Duke this year. I think Mark Williams is the key. I think Mark Williams, if he has a lottery level type year, and then Banchero has the year that a lot of folks are expecting, and then you get pretty good guard play, I think this team has a chance to do really well, but that's a lot of ifs. And that's kind of where we are with Duke now. It's very much a wait and see how these young players develop. And if these guys with experience, if Wendell Moore can have a better year this year, if Williams and Theo John, if those guys can be productive, and then you let the freshmen come along at their pace, I think the dynamic's pretty, set to be pretty good this year for them.
I do feel like it's a high ceiling. I think if they can come together and, play at the level that the coaching staff expects, I feel like it's impossible for them to go without having any, bumps in the road. It's a young team. They have some leadership, but they have a bunch of freshmen coming in. I think the ceiling is definitely there for them. It's just whether, how often they put it all together and when, because sometimes they put it together like we talk a lot about 2016-17 team. That team put it together probably a week or two too early in that ACC tournament. If they'd played like that, maybe in the NCAA tournament, we could be looking at a different story with that team. But yeah, and just Coach K, he said something. I was listening to a little snippet from his conversation with you last week in Charlotte, how he's approaching this year's team. And I thought it was interesting. I had never really thought about this, but he said it was very similar to how he approached USA basketball. And obviously you were there in Beijing, and you were there in 2010 for FIBA. So, can you just elaborate a little bit on that part of your conversation with him? And, what does that really mean? How does it change, in the past versus USA basketball compared to Duke? And, how is this year going to be different?
Yeah. The way that he described it was a lot has been taken off of his plate. So, with USA basketball, Jerry Colangelo, Sean Ford, Jim Tooley, the leadership at USA basketball, they handled all the logistics. They handled there was no recruiting associated with, there was no acquiring of players and all of that. Coach could just go out and coach basketball. And I think he feels that this year. He is more involved with recruiting than I think he's letting on and people think, but he's certainly not as involved as he has been since he got to Duke. He's not traveling. He's not doing anything like that. So he can really just focus on coaching this team. And, I don't know if they've talked about this or not, and I don't know how many people would recognize this, but like they're defending a little bit differently this year, like a drastic change this year than they have in the past. On not to get too X and O, but like on the wings, Duke has forever, they deny the one pass away. They get out in the passing lanes, they deny it. This year, they're doing more of an open contest, meaning they're not going to allow that opening pass, but they're open. They're not closed. And part of that is they're longer. He's got a longer team this year. They want to keep teams out of the paint. The pack line has taken over college basketball. And I think one of the things that Duke's defense is going to try to do this year is there are going to be some similarities. They're not playing the pack line, but the point is he's reinvented even the defense in his last year. Like he has coached it one way for 40 years. And in the final year, he's changing schematically how he's going to do his defense. So I think he's just had more time to think about basketball. And then, he spent more time with these players. One of the things he laments in this one and done era is that and I always say, one of the things that Coach K does best, the two things he does best, he coaches man-to-man defense and he's relationships. Nobody does relationships better than Coach K. And I think he's finding that this year he can focus on the basketball. And because he's around more and he's not having to travel in the offseason, he's been able to get to know these guys a little bit better. And so I think that's what he was talking about there, where it's very reminiscent when he was the head coach with USA Basketball. All he had to do was just focus on the basketball and the relationship building.
What would be your prediction for this team, in terms of within the ACC and nationally? What are your thoughts on how they can finish come March?
It's so interesting because you would probably know the numbers. I was listening to something the other day and like Duke hasn't won the regular season in quite some time. And I think part of that
I think it's 2010 was the last time, which was weird. I think they haven't won it outright since 2010, which is still mind-boggling. I think they've been picked. They just announced the order today, and I think they've been picked 4 of the last 5 years to finish first. So sorry to interrupt, but I think it was 2010, so it's 11 years, which is insane.
No, I'm glad you did, because that's even. I was on the bench in 2010. We obviously won a national championship that year. And when you look back on that season, that group won everything. Regular season, ACC tournament. We were in the preseason NIT. They won that, and then obviously won a national championship. So it was a harbinger of things to come. But, the point being, I think a lot of it, A, has to do with the unbalanced schedule in the league. But B, I think it has a lot to do with the timeline of development of these teams that he's had, these younger teams. So look, I think the top of the league is going to be better. It's certainly going to be better than it was last year. I think Louisville is going to be very good. I think Carolina is going to be much improved. Virginia, we know, is going to be who Virginia is. I think Syracuse is going to be better. So I think the top of that league will play better. But if this Duke team can figure out an offensive identity, where I think their defense is going to come a lot more quickly than their offense, in part because of Mark Williams at the front of the rim. I think that's going to be a real strength. But if they can figure out an identity here offensively, I think I think they are certainly capable of making the Final Four. Again, the unbalanced schedule, it's hard to know about the league, the regular season, but this team is certainly capable of making a run, Max. And I think it's a balanced team. I think it has the opportunity to have some strength up front. I think it certainly has the strength on the perimeter. And if they can figure out, a consistent way to score the basketball, I think the ceiling, as you said earlier, I think the ceiling's pretty high.
Right. Yeah. I just had a couple more, just in going through the schedule. There's a lot of interesting non-conference games, and I know the 3 that stand out are obviously those Kentucky, Gonzaga, Ohio State games, but the home opener is Army this year. I thought that was really interesting. That's definitely not some sort of random coincidence. So what do you think the significance of that, and what do you think that atmosphere will be like?
I think it's fantastic. I called the game, and I actually don't know if I'm going to be calling that game or not. I hope I am, but I called Duke played Army on Veterans Day 2 years ago. And I called that game. So my point in saying that is certainly not to self-promote, but to say that, I was able to see both sides. Like I was able to go to the Army shoot around and talk to Jimmy Allen, who's their head coach. And I was able to see the Duke side. And it was just really cool, man. Like it changes Coach K when I've been able to travel to West Point with him over, a handful of years over the last decade. And he almost goes back to that cadet Krzyzewski mindset, there's almost a childlike part of him that comes out. And I saw that a couple years ago when they played Army. I think the fact that it's his final year, I think will be nostalgic. It's obviously the home opener for Duke this year, which brings some nostalgia, especially after the Cameron Crazies weren't a part of it last year. So anytime I think he gets to interact with Army, I think is a good thing. And the fact that they're doing it this year in his final year, I think is pretty special. As an alum of Army, I hope we make it competitive, as we did for a half 2 years ago against that Zion team. But I'm excited. I'm glad it's on the schedule, and I hope it ends up. I hope it ends up being an entertaining event.
Can't let you get out of here without Final Four prediction. Who are your 4 teams? I know you don't, probably broadcasters, analysts don't love to make those predictions, but if you had to go four teams, who'd be your picks?
I think Kansas will be in a Final Four. I think UCLA, it's pretty crazy to say this. I think they're going to have a really good shot. And I think, not to use the word harbinger twice in a podcast, it's pretty pretentious, but I think their run at the end of the season was a harbinger of a season this year. They bring everybody back. I think they're going to have a great shot to be really, really good. Look, I think Michigan is going to have a shot to be really good as well. They bring back Hunter Dickinson, who I think is going to have a great shot at National Player of the Year. He had a fantastic season last year. They're going to have to fill in some pieces around him, but they've done a nice job recruiting. And so I think they're going to have a good year. Look, what the heck, I'll throw Duke in there just, because I'm sitting here with you. And I do think, again, I think they have the chance to have a really good season. And I've seen them a little bit. I've seen a couple practices. I watched their countdown scrimmage. I hate to keep beating this drum. If Mark Williams turns himself into a lottery pick this year, I think everybody else follows along with that. I think Banchero is special. So with no basketball played yet, I'll go homerism and I'll throw Duke into that 4. But as you know, man, it is this sport, especially in this league, just take the ACC. I mean, over almost half the league turned over from last season, which is insane. So it's very, very hard to know exactly what these teams are going to look like going in.
Yeah, I'm not even we have to make our predictions, on record and team MVPs and whether Duke will win the ACC, get to a Final Four. Yeah. I'm not a big fan of preseason predictions. I've never been right. I'll probably never get it right. And it's just really hard, especially like you said, with all the turnover in college basketball and, coaching turnover and player turnover. I mean, there's guys who like Texas and Kentucky this year. Those are 2 teams that are built mainly from transfers, and they're going to be, I would say Texas is probably a top 10 team the whole year, and Kentucky as well. I think last year was probably a fluke. It was definitely a fluke, but I think this year will show it pretty early. But yeah, Chris, this was awesome. Really appreciate the time. Thanks for giving your insights. It was a great discussion. Really hope a lot of what you said can be helpful. Be helpful for a lot of the listeners, which I'm sure it will be.
Awesome. Yeah, Max. Thanks, man. Anytime you need me, let me know.